of schedule and provide support worth up to £7,500 to millions of individuals. I'm pleased to tell the House that at the end of yesterday there had been more than 2 million claims, with grants worth £6 billion in total being claimed for. Those people will have the money in their bank accounts within 6 working days of their claim, and of course I will keep the scheme under review.
We go over to Tracy Brabin. Tracy Brabin.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Chancellor for his response. Despite the Chancellor saying the self-employment scheme was one of the most generous in the world, tens of thousands are still missing out. New starters, PAYE freelancers, those paid through dividends and those earning over £50,000. So can I ask the Chancellor 3 simple questions? Will the self-employed income support scheme be extended in line with the job retention scheme? Are there plans to lift the cap on profits? And will he please look again at supporting new starters?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, we've discussed these things before, but what I can tell the Honourable Lady is, with regard to removing the cap, I don't believe that would be the right or socially just thing to do. The average incomes of those above the cap are £200,000, and 95% of those who are self-employed in a majority way fall underneath the cap.
We have a substantive question. Owen Thompson, Chancellor.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question together with question 3. Our plan to support businesses and individuals is one of the most comprehensive in the world, Mr. Speaker. We have provided tens of billions of pounds in cash grants, tax cuts and discounted loans for businesses, pounds for deferred taxes for those who are self-employed and indeed employed and in business, world-leading job retention scheme to keep as many people in employment as possible, income protection for the self-employed, and a strengthened safety net to protect the most vulnerable in our society.
We're over the border to Owen Thompson with a supplementary. Owen Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Successful businesses in tourism and hospitality industries before the lockdown will face a very different reality at the end of it, with overseas visitors gone for the foreseeable future and social distancing in place. These businesses need time to reinvent themselves for the new post-COVID environment. What measures will the Chancellor introduce to enable much greater flexibility in the furlough scheme now to support them as they prepare for this new reality?
Mr. Speaker, it's precisely because of the time it takes for businesses to ramp up that last week I announced an extension to the furlough scheme all the way through to October to provide that runway for growth, in particular for those who will open later in tourism and hospitality. And as I said, we will introduce flexible furloughing in the extension period of that scheme.
Staying north of the border, we go over to Amy Callaghan. Amy Callaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those on fixed-term contracts in a particularly difficult situation, with employers who have placed them on furlough but who are unwilling to extend this past their contract end date. One employer highlighted to me that this is because they're concerned if they continue to furlough an employee without formally extending their contract, the HMRC will deem the furlough frivolous and seek reimbursement. Can the Chancellor confirm that employers can continue to furlough those whose fixed-term contracts have ended without any financial repercussion?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to look at the specific example mentioned. It would be important for us and to protect the taxpayer that we are paying furlough payments to those who are genuinely in employment and have a formal employment contract, but I'm happy to look at the specific example mentioned.
Can I welcome Shadow Minister Pat McFadden to the front bench? Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the interventions that the Chancellor has announced, some of our major industrial companies find themselves locked out of the lending scheme for the largest firms, the COVID corporate financing facility, because they're not classed as investment grade. These companies support hundreds of thousands of jobs, either directly or through their supply chains, and are often the main employers in the towns and cities where they operate. Will the government show the same flexibility and urgency in getting finance to these companies that make up the industrial backbone of Britain, as they have done through the loan scheme for small companies, so that we can retain as much economic capacity as possible through this crisis?
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the honourable member is absolutely right. Finance should flow to the industrial base of our country. With regard to investment grade, that relates to our corporate finance facility that the Bank of England run. I think it's important because this money is accessed by companies without any additional credit check by the government to protect the taxpayer. I think it is right that an investment grade rating is used for that. We have taken a flexible and generous interpretation of that, providing companies with the ability to use their bank rating to get access. And for those companies for whom commercial paper is not the right approach, many of the industrial companies he mentioned, we have a larger CBILS programme, which I'm in conversations with various industry stakeholders to make sure is appropriately sized to provide finance to every part of our industrial base.
Return to Scotland, to Glasgow, to the SNP spokesperson, Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Research by CIPD today has found that participants in the furlough scheme would otherwise have made up to 35% of their workforce redundant, rising up to half of workers in hospitality, where the uptake of the scheme is particularly high at around 80%. Hospitality and tourism were first out and will be last back. Many have no income and are building up debt, and many may feel compelled to sack workers if they're asked to pay more by the government at the end of July. Can I ask the Chancellor how he intends to prevent this and to support this part of the economy in the months ahead?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, it's precisely the retail and hospitality and leisure sector that has received the most direct fiscal support from this government through cash grants of £10,000 or £25,000 and an entire business rate holiday for the entire sector for the entire year, well beyond the point of reopening. My belief is that represents significant support, and the extension of the furlough scheme through to October gives those companies enough of a runway to grow back into a safe space.
We've got a substantive question, Mary Glindon, Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, as I announced last week, the coronavirus job retention scheme has been extended by 4 months until the end of October.
We go over to the North East with Mary Glindon. Mary Glindon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. New starters not registered with HMRC before the 19th of March and agency staff workers are some of those who currently find they are in limbo when it comes to accessing the job retention scheme. What more can the Chancellor do to help these workers now facing hardship?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, when I announced the scheme, we said that those who were on RTI or notified to HMRC on the 28th of February would be eligible. That covers 29.5 million workers in this country. What we did was find a way to extend that to the 19th of March, the day before the announcement was made. That protects the taxpayer against fraud, enables as many of those people to be included as possible. It brought another 230,000 people into the scheme, but it's important to remember this is a scheme that now covers, as I said, close to 30 million workers, and as of the end of last week, 8 million people from around 1 million businesses are covered by this scheme and having their wages paid by the government to protect their jobs and their future security.
Heading down to the southwest with Chair of the Select Committee, Mel Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Future Fund will provide venture capital-backed businesses with vital support, but of course it excludes those investments made through EIS and SEIS. It is certainly the case that there is significant public subsidy within those two schemes. However, businesses supported by them still face the challenges of the virus, and where successful, still go on to generate significant jobs. So I wonder if my right honourable friend might take a second look at the qualification requirements for the Future Fund and to see whether EIS and SEIS might be accommodated in some way.
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, as my right honourable friend will know well, EIS is a notified EU state aid, and that is what presents the challenge into providing EIS relief for convertible loaner instruments into the Future Fund. That said, guidance was published today. The fund will be open for applications on Wednesday. I've been crystal clear that should applications exceed the initial £250 million provided, I will be more than happy to expand the scheme, and I think this will be a vital part of fueling our recovery. As the right honourable member said, these companies provide the growth of tomorrow and they deserve our support.
Going to the Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodds, first of two questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour supported the introduction of the furlough scheme, and we've consistently called for it to become more flexible. We recognise it can't persist forever. However, according to press reports, the Treasury is considering asking all employers to pay 40% of employee wages on the JRS from the 1st of August. That risks a massive spike in job losses. What reassurance can he give us that he's looking at the evidence on the potential impact of unemployment of this, the potential impact on unemployment of imposing a uniform contribution across all sectors and individuals, including those sectors still under lockdown and those workers who are shielding or with unmet childcare needs? And will he publish that evidence?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, as I think the Shadow Chancellor has acknowledged previously, we are in deep consultation with both unions and business groups to make sure that we get the design of the second part of this scheme right. I think it is right, both for the economy and indeed for the taxpayer, to ask employers to make a contribution to paying the wages of their employees. They will have the benefit of flexowing furloughing to help offset that. And I couldn't comment now, but I did say details will be provided by the end of the month.
The least odds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the Chancellor's comments. However, we really need clarity around whether he's considering the evidence from other countries, which in many cases are calibrating changes to their salary backfill schemes with the lifting of the lockdown. Is he looking at that evidence, particularly on the potential impact of unemployment, or is he only looking at potentially the introduction of a uniform contribution from August the 1st? Thank you.
Chancellor.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, details at the end of the month, but the Honourable Member can rest assured I speak regularly to my counterparts in countries across the world to learn from their experience, and we'll make sure that our scheme continues to be one of the most generous, comprehensive and effective anywhere in the world.
We now go across to Stephen Barclay, the Minister, for a virtual answer to the substantive question tabled by Deanna Davison. Stephen Barclay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'll take this question together with questions 11, 12, 13 and 14. We have announced £3.2 billion of new funding for councils, alongside the £3.4 billion of further support with cash flow. I'm in regular contact with ministers in the relevant department on further support.
We now go across to Deanna Davidson. Deanna Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Treasury's unprecedented package of support, including the provision of grants which are benefiting many of the smallest businesses right across Bishop Auckland. But many small businesses in my constituency and others don't pay business rates because they're in shared spaces. So what steps is the Treasury taking to make these grants more readily available?
My honourable friend raises an important point, and that is why we've allocated a further £617 million of support for local authorities for discretionary payments for cases such as the one that she highlights, and local authorities are free to focus those payments in line with local need.
We now go across to Mark Palsey. Mark Palsey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, district councils are the level of local government that's closest to residents, and I know they've very much appreciated the support that the government has provided, but responding to the virus has incurred both additional expenditure and a loss of revenue. They've had less income from things like car parking and leisure services. So I wonder, how can the Minister ensure that district councils are able to not only meet their short-term demands, but also ensure a long-term sustainable future?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend is right to point to the particular pressures on lower tier councils, and that is why councils like Rugby have benefited from over £1 million of additional funding. 70% of district councils have received over £1 million, and that is why the profile for the second allocation of £1.6 billion was changed to recognise the points that he highlights.
We now go to Alan Kearns down in Wales. Alan Kearns.
I pay tribute to the Chancellor and to the Chief Secretary for their approach, and they will appreciate that the sums involved are staggering, but obviously necessary at this time. So does my right honourable friend recognise that this is an occasion where we appreciate the strength of the Union, the financial muscle to protect economies and communities in all parts of the UK? So has the Chancellor calculated whether individual nations could have acted independently? And if so, what impact has the collapse in the recent oil price had on that assessment?
Minister.
Well, My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and that is why £7 billion has been allocated through the Barnett consequentials, including £2.1 billion of additional funding to the Welsh Government. And of course, that sits alongside the UK-wide measures, such as the furlough scheme or the self-employed income support scheme that the Chancellor has announced.
Now go over to the southwest with Karen Smith. Karen Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Bristol, that current funding gap is 82.4 million as a result of the current crisis. So will the Treasury consider allowing local authorities to retain all surpluses against the business support grants so that these can be reinvested into local short-term interventions to get us through this crisis?
Minister.
Well, what we have seen through this crisis is an unprecedented level of support, including the £3.2 billion that have been announced, alongside the further £600 million of support specifically targeted at the care home sector. And of course, that sits alongside earlier funding, including the estimated 4.3% in real terms increase that councils received this year.
We now go over to Narendra Mishra in Stockport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Though the government's announcement of additional funding for local authorities in England is welcome, care staff, refuse collectors and social workers need to know that their work will continue to be funded once the current lockdown is over. My local council, Stockport, is facing a staggering shortfall of £25 million, with the cost of coronavirus response at £41 million. Will the Minister offer these workers that assurance?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right to highlight the importance of that sector. That is why the initial £1.6 billion that was announced in March was not ring-fenced. It was unring-fenced funding, and it sits alongside the £600 million announced last week. And in addition to that, the money that has helped with cash flow, including the £850 million targeted at adult social care that was paid in one go in April.
Do we have a substantive question for Robbie Moore? Minister.
My rightable friend, I know, has been working hard to highlight the importance of pedestrian crossing issues in his constituency. I'm very committed to working with him on that issue, and he can benefit from the significant funding announced for cycling and walking, including the £2 billion announced recently.
More.
Thank the right honourable friend for my response, and I'm pleased to hear that he will work with me in delivering a pedestrian bridge. And can I seek his further reassurance that he will meet with me and the transport team so that we can deliver this pedestrian bridge, vital piece of local infrastructure, connecting Silsden and Steeton in my constituency?
Minister.
I'm very happy, Mr. Speaker, to continue to liaise with my honourable friend on this important issue. And he will know that in addition to the £2 billion of money for walking and cycling, we also announced at the budget £4.2 billion for long-term local transport, and his authority, West Yorkshire Combined Authority, will be able to benefit from that.
Now go over to Gareth Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Treasury team for their leadership throughout this crisis and ask that as they look at ways to stimulate our economy, they consider issuing a UK Green Gilt as a specific way of funding local transport infrastructure, but also affirming this government's commitment to climate change.
Yeah. Minister.
Well, my honourable friend raises an important point, and whilst at present we have no plans to do so, he'll be well aware from the Green Finance Strategy that the government remains open to the introduction of new debt instruments, and I'm happy to continue discussing this issue with him.
I will now call Minister Jessie Norman to answer the substantive question tabled by Anthony Magnol. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also thank my honourable friend for his question. The government's committed to undertake a fundamental review of business rates, and it has published terms of reference at the budget. The review will be comprehensive and includes looking at the effectiveness and the operation of different reliefs and compliance with the tax. The call for evidence will be published in the coming months. Stakeholders will be invited to contribute their views throughout the review, and I very much welcome any thoughts or ideas my honourable friend may wish to add.
Anthony Bagnall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I welcome this government's wholesome package of support for the business sector and for the hospitality and tourism sector, showing that we are a government for the many, not the few. But I would also just like to add, would the Minister meet with me to see how we might be able to close the loophole for those who may be exploiting or taking opportunities over the business rates that are there at the moment?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for his question. And of course, if there are people who are illegitimately taking advantage of loopholes in the rates, then of course I'd be happy to discuss that. I would remind him that there may well be circumstances in which people are in fact complying with the rules. It's a fiddly area, and I just want to be absolutely certain that we're going after the people we should be.
Going over to Yorkshire to David Davis, Minister, substantive question.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will know that taxpayers with loan charge liabilities can already defer submission of their tax return until the 30th of September of this year. HMRC have always worked very hard, and this is no exception in particular, to support taxpayers who may need help to manage their disguised remuneration liabilities, and will continue to offer them the time they need to settle. And that, of course, affects those who may be affected by issues relating to coronavirus.
We go over to David Davis. David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, September of this year will be in the middle of the recession that we're about to face from this. But given the hundreds of billions the Treasury is already committing to supporting business to get us out of this recession, it will be a relatively trivial amount to write off the damaging loan charge policy. Originally, the Treasury forecast that they would raise $3.2 billion from this policy, less than $2.5 billion from employees. What does he estimate he'll now raise?
Minister.
Well, the Treasury will have published its estimate at the time of the original tax information note was published. I do think, however, that my honourable friend, I understand the passion he brings to the issue, but I would remind him that 99.8% of taxpayers do not engage in disguised remuneration schemes, and the fact that we are supporting people across this country in their jobs and in their livelihoods is not in and of itself a reason to let people who owe tax off the tax that is due.
I will now call Minister John Glenn to answer the substantive question that's been tabled by Daniel Zeitner. Minister Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Treasury is working closely with the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy to monitor the uptake and effectiveness of the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme. The scheme has already helped thousands of businesses since its launch on the 23rd of March and is continuing to ramp up. As of the 10th of May, almost 36,000 facilities with a value of over $6 billion have been approved through the CBILS. SMEs have a choice of over 60 lenders now offering finance under CBILS, and further announcements on numbers will happen later this week.
Going over to Cambridge with Daniel Zeitner. Daniel Zeitner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite that, the uptake of the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan has been disappointing, leading to the bounce-back loans. Could we have much more accurate reporting on this, much more like the health statistics, and perhaps also by region, so we can see what's actually happening?
Minister.
We're looking very carefully at the figures, and we publish them on a weekly basis. I'm having conversations with banks on a regular basis, and we're having a roundtable this week to monitor progress. We will be looking to make further interventions should that be necessary, but absolutely it's important that these loans get out quickly as they've been designed to.
Substantive question, Cat Smith, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government has recently allocated up to an additional £617 million to local authorities to enable them to give grants to businesses excluded from existing schemes. This will enable many thousands of businesses in the situation described by the Honourable Member to receive cash grants.
We're going over to the wonderful county of Lancashire, Cat Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will he ask local authorities to report on the extent to which landlords are passing on the grants to their tenants? Because it isn't just in Lancaster and Fleetwood that we're seeing widespread evidence that this is not occurring.
Minister.
I think the Honourable Lady makes a reasonable point. We're monitoring the effectiveness of all these schemes and the way that local authorities are using their discretion in actually giving out these grants. But this is a matter that we will continue to examine carefully.
I will now call Minister Kemi Badenoch to answer a substantive question that's been tabled by Kate Green. I now come to Minister Kate Badenoch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is closely monitoring the impact of COVID-19 on local communities across the UK. We're engaging with local authorities, local enterprise partnerships and mayoral combined authorities and remain committed to levelling up opportunity all over the UK.
Going over to Marvellous Manchester with Kate Green. Kate Green.
The public transport infrastructure will be essential to Greater Manchester's economic recovery, and funding has been provided to help Manchester Metrolink. But this is insufficient, and the situation will be exacerbated because social distancing will mean that it can carry fewer passengers for the foreseeable future. Will the Treasury commit to fully funding Metrolink so that it can get the city region back on its feet?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have been in conversation with Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, and Treasury is well aware of this issue. At the moment, we have provided £630 million for councils. We have provided some funding to the Metrolink, and we will continue to explore this issue further.
We've got a substantive question, Minister, from Jacob Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is right that hydrogen could play an important role in our transition to net zero. That's why we're investing up to £121 million to support a range of projects to explore and develop the potential of low-carbon hydrogen technology.
Go over to Jacob Young. Jacob Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my honourable friend agree with me that incentivising low-carbon technologies like hydrogen and carbon capture and storage will aid us in our recovery, help the government reach its net zero targets and level up across all regions of the UK?
Minister.
He is absolutely right. Budget 2020 announced at least £800 million to develop carbon capture and storage infrastructure. He will, of course, know that Teesside is one of 4 sites under consideration for support through this funding.
We're now moving on to the next set of questions where we'll be introducing the Secretary of State for Transport. I will call the Secretary of State, Grant Shapps, to answer the substantive question tabled by Stephen Metcalfe. Secretary of State.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to group this question with number 2. We estimate that over 1.3 million people have returned to the UK via commercial routes, the majority by our work to keep the vital routes open.
We go over to Stephen Metcalfe. Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's hugely welcome that 1.3 million people have been brought home by commercial airlines. Can my right honourable friend assure me that he continues to work with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to ensure support and guidance is available for those people who are struggling, and there are many of them struggling to find commercial routes home?
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank my honourable friend. Yes, I can absolutely provide him that reassurance. The UK's got very close links with Nigeria and elsewhere. I'm very pleased that we've been able to support charter flights, enabling around 1,700 British travellers to return home since the 18th of April.
We go over to John Howell. In Henley, John Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my right honourable friend for helping with other departments to bring so many of my constituents home safely. In my role as the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Nigeria, could the Minister say what the situation is there with regard to the availability of aircraft and how many more repatriation trips we are looking to make?
To State.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, my honourable friend's great work as a trade envoy is known across the House. It is the case that there are still some commercial routes available. We're keeping that international advice under constant review, and we are still on a daily basis organising charter flights to bring the remaining overseas British nationals home. I think the number is at about 20,000 still to repatriate.
We've got a substantive question from Clerk Tino, Secretary of State.
We're speaking regularly with companies across the aviation sector to encourage them to draw on the government's various different packages of cross-economy financial support.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. With Gatwick on my doorstep, I've got a lot of constituents who work in the aviation sector. Could the Secretary of State outline what support he's giving to airlines to make sure that they're employing people and continuing employment where they can, but also what support he'll give to aviation workers who will need to transition into other forms of employment as well?
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend's absolutely right. There's a huge amount of support that we're making available, including things like the coronavirus large business scheme, the coronavirus job retention furloughing scheme, in other words, and various other business interruption schemes. But it is true to say, Mr. Speaker, of course, airlines and aviation in general is facing a particularly hard time, first into this crisis, and with quite a long tail, we think, to come out of it. And I'm working very closely, therefore, with my honourable friend in the Department for Work and Pensions to support workers who lose their jobs as well.
We go over to north of the border again with the SNP spokesperson, Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish Government, of course, have given full business rates relief to the aviation sector. In contrast, the UK Government promised sectoral support for aviation before reneging. Last week, we heard Willie Walsh flounder before the Transport Select Committee when trying to justify the cull of 12,000 employees, British Airways employees, including many from BA Cityflyer based at Edinburgh, despite having access to €10 billion of liquidity, the vast majority of which was generated by British Airways profits. So what is the government actually doing to prevent tens or even hundreds of thousands of job losses in the sector?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, not only do we have the Bank of England scheme, which enables companies that wouldn't ordinarily have the ability to raise money through a sort of paper route. We've also got the business interruption loan scheme for different sized businesses, the time to pay flexibility, financial support to employees and VAT deferrals. But, Mr. Speaker, I should point out we also have a special process in place available only to the aviation sector. So when they've run out of those other forms of options, they can talk to us about those. And that request needs to be made formally in writing to me. I then discuss it with Treasury, and a large number of aviation-orientated businesses are in that process.
We're now going back up to Greater Manchester with Mike King. Mike King.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. British aviation is in free fall. BA, Ryanair, Virgin Atlantic and now the Emirates are set to lay off tens of thousands of staff. The job retention scheme is becoming the job restructuring scheme. We can't allow that. And with the added difficulty and confusion of the government's travel quarantine measures, will the Secretary of State urgently bring forward an aviation support package for the sector, matching Labour's commitment?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's a very welcome change, actually, because ordinarily I've stood at this dispatch box and from my opposite numbers heard a lot of attacks on the aviation business. I absolutely will bring forward enormous amounts of support to aviation businesses, including all of those schemes that I just mentioned before. I can tell the House there are 43,500 furloughed staff right now from the airlines alone, another 2,600 from airports. And I am very acutely aware of the job losses and proposed job losses, for which we're very concerned, which is why we have the additional scheme, which is actually called the Birch process with the Treasury. Although I can't go into each individual detail for reasons of confidentiality, I can assure the honourable gentleman that that work is very much ongoing.
We have a substantive question from Anne McLaughlin, Secretary of State.
The government's announced financial support measures worth £350 billion and is working with the sector to overcome specific challenges.
We're now going to north of Bud again. Anne McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard about the challenges of the aviation industry, including the threat of 12,000 BA redundancies, but the entire transport industry is worried. Haulage is seeing volumes dropping and revenues plummeting. The coaching sector faces imminent ruin, and holiday companies have no idea if government will stand by them and their customers. So what specific action is the Secretary of State taking to ensure we actually have a transport industry left when all of this is over?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the answer is multi-billion pounds programme, which of course rescued our railways, £400 million used to keep our bus services going, and I have to say a multi-million pound plan also for critical freight routes, which enabled us to keep a total of 16 different routes available with 17 different contracts in place, enabling us to have vital food and supplies to this country.
We go over to Chair of the Select Committee, Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware that the aviation industry is a sector in need of support. Can I ask if he will consider air bridges so that those entering the UK from countries where the infection rate is below the rate of 1 would not be subject to quarantine. This will boost confidence in the aviation travel and target safety where it's most needed.
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I should say, and in answer to a previous question, that final details of the quarantine scheme will be released soon, come in early next month. It is the case that we should indeed consider further improvements. For example, things like air bridges enabling people from other areas, countries who have themselves achieved lower levels of coronavirus infection to come to the country. So those are active discussions, but will go beyond what will initially be a blanket situation.
I will now call Minister Andrew Stevenson to answer the substantive question that's been tabled by Kevin Hollenrake. Minister Andrew Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great joy to join you from sunny Pendle. We are investing in transport infrastructure to level up the United Kingdom with £500 million to reverse the beaching cuts and £5 billion extra support for buses and cycling.
Kevin Hollenrake.
Thank you. Some of us don't have those hair problems, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister confirm his commitment to investment right across the north? The big projects like Northern Powerhouse Rail, all from the east coast through to the west coast, and the smaller but no less important projects like the dualling of the A64 in my constituency.
Yeah. Going over to lovely Lancashire, Andrew Stevenson.
I'm happy to provide my honourable friend with that reassurance. The integrated rail plan looking at various transport investments in the north. We very much intend for that still to report by the end of this year. And I can assure him on the dualling of the A64, that is now officially in the RIS3 pipeline and will be investigated carefully as we prepare to make decisions for the next strategy.
Now going down to the southwest with Kerry McCarthy. Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's so good to see so many cities and towns now putting in place infrastructure to support active travel, particularly cycling. But not everyone can walk or cycle to work. Not everyone has a car. And no one wants the new normal to be cars clogging up the streets and despoiling the clean air. So why isn't the government working with city regions and other councils on a safety-led scaling up of passenger transport? Why didn't it talk to local leaders about public transport before urging a return to work? And why is there a support package for TfL, but not for our other major cities?
Minister.
So we are working closely with all the Metro mayors and the devolved mayoral combined authorities in order to get this policy right. It is incorrect to say that we have only provided support for Transport for London. We have, as was talked about in Treasury questions, we have already provided significant support to things like the Manchester Metrolink and other schemes. It is right to say, though, that we need to ensure that inclusive travel is at the forefront of this, and there is a huge amount of work underway in the department to ensure that particularly disabled people are able to return safely to work and use the public transport network that so many depend on.
Minister, we've got a substantive question from Mambos Torolambos. Can you do the substantive question, please?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to group this question with question 11 and question 12. I pay tribute to all public transport drivers and workers who have been working incredibly hard to ensure that those on the front line can get to work. New safer transport guidance was published on the 12th of May, and we're working closely with transport operators across the sector on its implementation.
Last week's ONS figures show that public transport drivers have one of the highest COVID-19 related death rates compared to other professions. With the government encouraging people to go back to work and many workers having no choice but to use public transport, what extra measures has the government taken to protect drivers and other public transport workers?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. The safety of public transport workers is, of course, paramount for the government, and we have been working with operators to ensure that additional measures are put in place. These include risk assessments, looking at who should be at work, social distancing and face coverings, workforce planning, queue and passenger flow management, and the way that emergency incidents are dealt with, in addition to cleaning, ventilation, communications, and other forms of training.
We now go over to Clive Lewis in Norwich. Clive Lewis. Going to have to go over to Julie Elliott. We can't hear Clive Lewis. Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for his answer. In order to protect public transport workers' safety, they need job security. The government's funding arrangement runs out with the Metro and Nexus on the 9th of June. So not only risk assessments taking place are fine, but we need the trains to run. Can the government tell me when the arrangements will be made with Metro and Nexus to allow our crucial metro system to carry on running?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continue to work with the Metro mayors to look at these issues and work closely in conjunction with Treasury ministers to ensure that the funding necessary is provided and we can support public transport networks right across the length and breadth of the United Kingdom.
We now come to Jim McMahon and his new job. Congratulations, Jim McMahon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I start off by paying tribute to our frontline transport workers and also offer my condolences to those who have lost their lives through COVID-19. The latest advice from government explicitly now rules out providing PPE such as face masks to drivers, instead reserving them for health and social care workers. The response on this is that the health advice apparently doesn't support it. So if the evidence says that masks won't save them, that gloves won't save them, that banning the handling of cash won't save them, well, it begs the question, what will save them, given that transport workers, including bus drivers, are more likely to die from COVID-19 than the general population? And can that evidence be provided in the House of Commons library so it can be properly investigated and looked at? We cannot allow transport workers on the front line working to keep our country moving to face a greater risk than the general population.
Minister Stevens.
Well, can I start by welcoming the Shadow Secretary of State to his position? It continues to be PHE advice that face masks are not necessary outside of clinical settings or where HSE and employer risk assessments suggest it would be necessary to protect against non-COVID-19 risks. However, workers should refer to the guidance, which I mentioned before, when considering whether wearing a face covering would be appropriate and should consider using a face covering when social distancing is not possible.
We now go to the substantive question, Minister, from Sir Edward Lee.
Recent analysis by LNER indicates that such a service could be viable and that the department is exploring this further.
We now go audio only to Sir Edward. Sir Edward Lee.
Yes, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, you haven't got a picture because the broadband in rural Lincolnshire is so bad. That's why it's even more important that we get our through train to London from Grimsby and Cleethorpes down to London, which we've been promised again and again, a huge catchment area. All the government has to do is to kickstart this project, given that they're spending £100 billion on HS2, is just to give us £1 million and then LNER will give us the through train. Will the government now fulfil their promises and kickstart the through train to London from Grimsby and Cleethorpes?
Minister Stevenson.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. He has lobbied me on this several times already, and I know that my honourable friend, the Rail Minister, the member for Daventry, is looking very closely at what he says, and hopefully he may have some good news in due course.
Thank you. I will now call Minister Christine Harris to answer the substantive question that's been tabled by Gareth Johnson. Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take this question and the next one from Andrew Jenkins together. We have extended refunds to all ticket types and made claiming refunds easier to ensure passengers do not lose out financially.
We now go to Gareth Johnson. Gareth Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Minister what discussions he's had with rail operators like South Eastern over season ticket holders who've got just a couple of months left on their season ticket and because of the virus have been unable to travel but are ineligible for a refund? These commuters have suffered quite considerably and it would be welcome news if there was some assistance available for them.
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. The government actually have been talking to train operators throughout this whole process, as he would expect, but we do not have plans to extend season tickets, and season ticket holders are already entitled to request a refund in accordance with the National Rail Conditions of Travel. Over 100,000 season ticket holders have already claimed refunds totalling £150 million in the current COVID travel restriction period.
We're going over to Yorkshire with Andrea Jenkins. Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You may hear my toddler chanting away in the background. So it's crucial that people who are doing the right thing and avoiding public transport are not left out of pocket. Now, can my right honourable friend therefore confirm that passengers in Morley and outward who had purchased their advance tickets, as well as the season tickets that you've already mentioned, will be able to receive a refund without any charge of any unused travel during the outbreak? Thank you.
Minister.
I thank the honourable lady for a question. We've worked with the rail industry to temporarily extend refunds to all ticket types. These changes reflect the exceptional circumstances and the government's advice to avoid unnecessary travel. Anytime off-peak and super off-peak tickets can be refunded as usual, and since the 17th of March, all admin fees have been waived. Advance tickets purchased before the 23rd of March for travel from that date onwards are eligible for a fund-free refund whether the train is cancelled or not. Unused carnet tickets can be refunded or extended depending on the train operator, and season tickets, including station car park season tickets, are already refundable, so we've not changed this policy. A £10 admin fee remains for season ticket refunds.
Well, you've made your husband very happy. Now we go to Andrew Griffith with a substantive question, Minister. Minister, substantive.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I was worried about my husband for a moment. Problem or opportunity, Mr. Speaker, whichever way you take it. The government is investing around £48 billion in maintaining and upgrading the rail network between 2019 and 2024, focused on increasing reliability and punctuality for passengers, including in West Sussex.
Andrew Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank my honourable friend for his reply and for the significant extra investment that this government is making in rail transport. As we seek to regrow the economy, may I ask him to consider the investment project known as the Arundel Chord, which would enable trains to turn east near Arundel and to travel directly to Horsham, significantly improving the resilience of rail services for my constituents in Arundel and South Downs.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, Network Rail has recently concluded a study into services in the West Sussex area, produced in consultation with local authorities and stakeholders. And whilst the Arundel Chord might have value as a diversionary route, its capacity would be limited and would cause a negative impact on existing Arun Valley and West Coastway services. However, the study has suggested numerous beneficial changes involving train services and infrastructure, which my department would take forward with Network Rail, which will benefit all of my honourable friends' constituents.
I will now call Minister Rachel Maclean to answer the substantive question that's been tabled by Daniel Zeitner. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with permission, I would like to group this question with question 20. The government is providing significant funding for the bus industry at this time. Our COVID-19 funding package for England's buses totals £397 million. As part of this, local authorities have access to a £30 million supported bus services fund. To date, 46 bids have been received. No bids have yet been received for the Rural Mobility Fund because the deadline is the 4th of June.
Going over to Cambridge with Daniel Zeitner. Daniel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful. Of course, hydrogen-powered buses have a much longer range, making them more suitable for rural routes and rural areas. And we have some of the leading hydrogen-powered bus manufacturers in the world. So we have the government's introduced the all-electric bus town scheme. Where's the equivalent for hydrogen?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable gentleman is right that we are focusing on new all-electric bus towns, which is an exciting part of the money that the Prime Minister has announced to support buses up and down the country. But it's not right to say that we're not focusing on hydrogen buses, because we have actually allocated £4,360,000 to hydrogen buses and supporting infrastructure.
We go over to Jane Hunt.
Thank you very much.
The government has published recently the Safer Transport Guidance for Operators, which is very welcome indeed. But I'm wondering if you could set out what steps are being taken to ensure financial viability of bus services whilst maintaining social distancing. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and I can tell her that we're working urgently to provide further support to bus operators so that they can ramp up service provision as people return to work and at the same time observe social distancing.
Minister, substantive question, Ruth Cadbury.
On the 9th of May, the government announced a £2 billion package of support for active travel. This includes £250 million of funding this financial year to support people to take up cycling and to enable local authorities to make their roads and pavements safer.
Over to Ruth Cadbury. Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the £250 million of funding so cycling and walking improvements can be rapidly installed ahead of the tidal wave of expected traffic as people go back to work. But when will the government finally publish both its long-awaited revised design guidance on cycle-friendly infrastructure and also the evidence that it commissioned back in 2018 on the amount of funding needed to meet its targets to double cycling and increase walking by 2025?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and I recognise that she's a really keen cyclist, and we want to boost cycling across the country. The schemes that she's referring to are being worked at, and we can provide further details of those in due course.
Minister, substantive question, Barry Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And ministers have been in discussion with Cabinet colleagues about measures protecting the welfare of delivery drivers, including those carrying food.
Barry Sherman.
But Mr. Speaker, there is growing evidence at a time in this crisis when many of us are very dependent on home delivery, that children as young as 16 on a provisional licence wobble onto the road delivering, holding a mobile phone in one hand with Google Map on it. This is a very dangerous situation. Is the Minister not aware of a large number of reports of young people being killed and seriously injured because these young people are not qualified to drive and are doing a very dangerous task?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and of course the government would be concerned of the incidents that he mentions. But ensuring the safety of drivers making deliveries is of paramount importance, and the government doesn't want anyone to feel unsafe or unsure as to whether they have the necessary equipment to work safely. And that's why detailed guidance has been issued to all transport workers in conjunction with our colleagues in the Bays Department.
I will now call Minister Kelly Tollerhurst to answer the substantive question tabled by Munira Wilson. Minister Kelly Tollerhurst.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department and I are working with airlines, airports and unions to understand the full impact that COVID-19 is having on the sector and its workers.
Munira Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents are long-serving members of British Airways staff, yet they face redundancy or being stripped of their terms and conditions, despite BA furloughing some 23,000 staff. Does the Minister think this is responsible behaviour by Britain's flag carrier? What pressure is she bringing to bear on the company, and will she guarantee that any bailout comes with stringent and binding conditions on reducing carbon emissions?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and I understand it's a worrying time for airline staff and their families. I've been speaking regularly with companies across the sector to encourage them to draw down on the unprecedented support package. With regards to terms and conditions of employment, they are for negotiation between the employee and the employer, but we stand ready in the department to support any workers affected.
We now have a substantive question, Minister, with Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend, my officials and I are working with the company and the councils alongside the extensive financial packages announced by the Chancellor.
We go to Stephen Morgan.
I thank the Minister for that reply, and I know the Secretary of State, when meeting council leaders last week, spoke positively about government providing a package of support to secure the future of the ferry service. So I look forward to the department in achieving this. Mr. Speaker, the continuation of the Gosport ferry post this crisis is vital to the connectivity of communities along the south coast, but so too is tackling the climate crisis. As the fourth most congested city in the UK, Portsmouth faces some of the worst air pollution levels outside of London. The Pompey Street Space campaign aims to give pedestrians and cyclists priority, widen narrow pavements and create commuter cycle routes to allow people to travel safely.
Minister, we're going over to the Minister to answer. Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, although I missed the end point. Absolutely, the Gosport ferry service provides an important service for the local community in regards to navigating their way around the peninsula. And that's why myself, my right honourable friend, met with the council leaders. We've spoken with the organisation, and my officials are working with the councils to find a support package that would be suitable for the operators in order to maintain that service.
Going to Northern Border with Amy Callaghan. Substantive question, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are working across government and closely with the sector on establishing a clear vision and objectives for the recovery of the sector.
Amy Callaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The day prior to the announcement of BA City Flyer redundancies at Edinburgh Airport, Willie Walsh gave evidence to the Transport Committee where he did not mention this once. It's inconceivable that he was not aware of this announcement, so does the Minister share my frustration that this lack of transparency simply prevents Parliament from performing effective scrutiny?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable lady for her question. The aviation sector is so important for the UK economy, and that's why we've been able to draw down, they have been able to draw down an unprecedented supporter package. I and the department have set up a restart and recovery unit to work with the industry, and that includes unions, ground handlers, airlines and airports in order to come up with strong measures in order to aid the recovery and restart of the aviation sector.
We now come to the statement by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, exceptionally in order to allow more backbenchers to participate during the limited time available. I've asked the Secretary of State to keep his initial statement to 8 minutes, with maximum reductions from other frontbenchers. I now call Secretary of State Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And with permission, I'd like to make a statement on coronavirus. This is the most serious public health emergency in 100 years, but through the combined efforts of the whole nation, we've got through the peak. And let's not forget what together has been achieved. We flattened the curve, and now the number of people in hospital with coronavirus is half what it was at the peak. We protected the NHS, and the number of patients in critical care is down by 2/3. Mercifully, the number of deaths across all settings is falling. This Mental Health Awareness Week, it's an important reminder that we need to look after ourselves as well as each other. And if you need support with your mental health, the NHS is there for you. This is particularly important for frontline staff, and we've supported all NHS trusts to develop 24/7 mental health lines. Mr. Speaker, our plan throughout this crisis has been to slow the spread and protect the NHS. Thanks to the resolve of the British people, the plan is working, and we're now in the second phase of this fight. And I want to update the House on the next steps that we're taking as part of that plan. First, we're protecting the nation's care homes with a further £600 million available directly to care homes in England. We've prioritised testing for care homes throughout, and we've made sure that every care home has a named NHS clinical lead, and we're requiring local authorities to conduct daily reviews of the situation on the ground so that every care home gets the support it needs each and every day. All of this amounts to an unprecedented level of scrutiny and support for the social care system, and a level of integration with the NHS that is long overdue. Second, Mr. Speaker, the 4 UK Chief Medical Officers have today updated the case definition to include a new symptom. Throughout this pandemic, we've said that if you develop a new continuous cough or a fever, then you should immediately self-isolate. From today, we are including anosmia, which means that if you've lost your sense of smell or experiencing a change in your normal sense of smell or taste, that can be a symptom of coronavirus, even where the other symptoms are not present. So from today, if you develop a continuous cough or fever or anosmia, you should immediately self-isolate for at least 7 days in line with the guidelines. Members of your household should self-isolate for 14 days. By updating the case definition in line with the latest science, we can more easily recognise the presence of the virus and more effectively fight it. Third, Mr. Speaker, we are expanding eligibility for testing further than ever before. Over the past 6 weeks, this country has taken a small specialised diagnostics industry and scaled it at breathtaking pace into a global champion. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, we conducted 100,678 tests. Every day, we're creating more capacity. And that means more people can be tested, and the virus has fewer places to hide. Today, I can announce to the House that everyone aged 5 and over with symptoms is now eligible for a test. That applies right across the UK in all 4 nations from now. Anyone with a new continuous cough, a high temperature, or the loss or change of sense of taste or smell can book a test by visiting nhs.uk/coronavirus. If you're eligible for a test and you don't have internet access, you can call 119 in England and Wales, or in Scotland and Northern Ireland, 0300 303 2713. We'll continue to prioritise access to tests for NHS and social care patients, residents and staff. And as testing ramps up towards our new goal of total capacity of 200,000 tests a day, ever more people will have the confidence and certainty that comes with an accurate test result. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, I want to update the House on building our army of contact tracers. Today, I can confirm that we have recruited over 21,000 contact tracers in England. This includes 7,500 healthcare professionals who will provide our call handlers with expert clinical advice. They will help manually trace the contacts of anyone who's had a positive test and advise them on whether they need to isolate. They have rigorous training with detailed procedures designed by our experts at Public Health England. Mr. Speaker, they have stepped up to serve their country in its hour of need, and I want to thank them in advance for the life-saving work that they're about to do. The work of these 21,000 people will be supported by the NHS COVID-19 app, which we're piloting on the Isle of Wight at the moment and will then roll out across the rest of the country. Taken together, this means that we now have the elements we need to roll out our national test and trace service, the testing capacity, the tracing capability and the technology. Building that system is incredibly important, but so too are the basics. We need everyone to self-isolate if they have or if someone in their household has symptoms. We need everyone to keep washing their hands and following the social distancing rules. We need everyone to stay alert because this is a national effort and everyone has a part to play. The goal is to protect life and allow us carefully and cautiously to get back to doing more of the things that make life worth living. That is our goal, and we're making progress towards it, and I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Secretary of State for Health, Jonathan Ashworth, who has 4 minutes. Jonathan Ashworth.
Grateful. Just on the issue of symptoms, he will know that many healthcare specialists were making these warnings eight weeks ago. So can he explain why there has been a time lag in updating the case definition? And I know what he said about social care today, but he will be aware that over 12,500 people have sadly died in care homes because of COVID-19. Now, last week he said he'd put a protective ring around care homes from February, but yesterday a care home provider in the Sunday Times wrote, and I quote, "Elderly people weren't a priority and, I quote, the government were asleep at the wheel. Isn't the reality that there was no early lockdown of care homes when needed? There was no testing of people transferred from hospital to care homes until mid-April, seeding this virus. PPE was requisitioned from care home staff and given to the NHS because of wider shortages. There was indeed guidance suggesting infection was unlikely, and that guidance was still in place when there was community transmission, and we still do not have full testing of all residents and care home staff 12 weeks later. No wonder Age UK has said that this is too little too late. I note he said testing will be expanded. Can he bring forward the date by which all care home residents and staff will be routinely tested? In the document from last week, it says by June the 6th. Why can we not have that date sooner? And has this crisis not shown that our care sector is staffed by exceptional, dedicated people, and that migrant care workers are not low-skilled but immensely able? Does he agree that the Home Office should acknowledge that and praise such potential workers, not penalise them? On the wider rollout of testing, I welcome that. He didn't mention the antibody test. Could he update the House on that front? It's also reported today that 20% of hospital patients got COVID while in for another illness. Now, 2 weeks ago, he suggested to me in the House that he planned to roll out screening of all healthcare workers, whether symptomatic or not. Can he update us on that front? On tracing, I have long argued that the safe way to transition out of lockdown is by having a test, trace and isolation strategy in place, but it depends on quick turnaround of test results. Can he tell us what is the current median time for test results to be received by someone when carried out by the Deloitte and other private sector testing facilities, and how soon do directors of public health and GPs receive those results? He knows that I believe he should be making better use of local public health services, but nonetheless he's pressing ahead with the national call centre delivered by Serco. But can he tell us by what date will that tracing service be operational? Will it be operational by the 1st of June? And he didn't talk about isolation as one of his key elements of testing, of the test trace strategy. Many poorer people will not be able to self-isolate. Will he look at providing facilities for such people, whether it's empty hotel rooms so they can quarantine, and will those in the insecure work be guaranteed sick pay if they are asked to isolate for 7 or 14 days? On the R number, will he guarantee that every easing of restriction, such as asking children to return to school, is accompanied by a government statement of the expected impact on the R number and the underlying prevalence of infection? And if R rises to be greater than 1 in a region or local area, how will the government respond? And as he says, this is Mental Health Awareness Week. We are very fearful of a growing burden of mental health issues, especially in children as a result of this lockdown. What extra investment is he putting in mental health services, particularly children's health services? And of course, NHS staff who are threatened not only by exposure to this virus, but also through the trauma, emotional distress and burnout associated with working on the front line, need support as well, because they need PPE, they need fair pay, they need mental health support. Those care workers who are caring for us need us for care for them, and we should thank them again in Mental Health Awareness Week.
I now call Secretary Matt Hancock for a concise reply. Matt Hancock.
I will keep it concise, Mr. Speaker. Your instruction. On the questions that he asked about care homes, he's right to ask detailed questions about care homes, because making sure that we have the protection, that ring of protection around care homes is important. Of course, the majority of care homes have not had an outbreak at all, and we should thank those running care homes for the incredible hard work and the infection control that they've put in place, meaning that in a total of 62% of all care homes there has not been an outbreak, and where there's been rigorous infection control and a huge amount of work gone into that. We have, as he said, now got testing for all, and that of course started with testing throughout for people who had the first symptoms in a care home, but now is for all staff and all residents, whether symptomatic or not. There was no large-scale removal of people from hospital into care homes towards the start of this crisis, as has been implied by some. In fact, the number of people moving from hospital into care homes has fallen throughout this crisis, and that has been those movements have been done with care. But the thing I agree with him on is that this crisis has shown that there are many lessons for reform in the social care sector, not least the much closer integrated working with the NHS that we've seen in these crisis days. He asked about the rollout of contact tracing. We now have the people in place. The app is successfully being piloted, and we are ready and preparing for rolling out that system. He asked for the median time of a test to get back. The median time is, as far as I understand it, under 48 hours. He made a rather uncharacteristic dig at private sector businesses who are helping us to deliver this. None of this testing capability, not a single test, will be possible without the private sector, and his attempt to divide people between private and public sector is entirely wrong. I think he should remember that bit of the Labour Party left the shadow cabinet a couple of months ago, and I thought good sense had returned. He asks about local public health services. That is incredibly important that local public health services are involved, and we brought in Tom Riordan, the Chief Executive of Leeds City Council, a brilliant public servant, to lead the work on engagement with local public health services, which he rightly, I totally agree with him, is an incredibly important part of getting this right. We of course keep R under review, and we keep watching it, and we keep surveying to find out what it is. And we've said that if it rises above 1, if we see an outbreak in an area, then we will be perfectly prepared to take action in that area. And indeed, if it goes dangerously high nationally, we'd be prepared, as we were before, to take necessary action. Finally, Mr. Speaker, he rightly talked about the importance of mental health services across the board. The support is there in the NHS for all NHS staff. It's in fact there across the board. And one of the interesting things in this crisis is that paediatric mental health services have discovered that many services provided over computers are in fact better received especially by children, than face-to-face. And in some cases, that service, therefore, is better provided over a distance, over the screen, rather than face-to-face. But he's absolutely right to highlight the importance of mental health services in this crisis and beyond.
We now go across the chair of the Select Committee, who I understand is audio only, Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd just like to ask the Health Secretary 3 pieces of data, please, all of which are essential for this strategy. Firstly, what level of new daily infections do we need to be down to before contact tracing will happen for all new infections? Secondly, how many daily tests will the test and trace system need? And thirdly, if we're going to introduce weekly testing for all NHS and care home frontline staff, when will our testing capacity be sufficient to deliver that on top of test and trace?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We think with 21,000 contact tracers now employed, we think that that is capacity for the current level of new cases that's been demonstrated by the ONS surveys, although I'm perfectly prepared to hire more to make sure we have spare capacity within contact tracing. On the number of tests needed daily to service the test and trace, of course it depends exactly how many new cases there are, again, and it depends on the relationship between the symptoms and the number of positive cases, and there are many more people with the symptoms than there are positive coronavirus cases, but the number is falling because we're moving well away from the flu season, and at this time of year the number of positive cases for positive symptoms of coughs and of fever tends to fall because other non-coronavirus communicable diseases like flu are falling. So actually there isn't a specific answer to that question because it changes over time. And on weekly tests, that we are looking for to put together a plan to make sure we cut in-hospital transmission, including the regular testing of the right staff appropriately in the NHS, and I'll write to him with more details as and when that policy is fully announceable.
We have a technical problem with Dr. Philippa Whitford, who we'll come back to shortly. So we're going to Sir Desmond Swade. Sir Desmond.
Mr. Speaker, the regional dental hubs offer little more than extractions, but I want to keep my teeth. When will dentists be able to treat their own patients?
Impression, Secretary of State.
Well, my right honourable friend rightly points out that we have urgent dental hubs. So anybody who does need urgent dentistry can get a dentist appointment through their GP. I've had many people ask, in an emergency, how can I get to see a dentist? And the dentistry is there and available. It's a very important message for all of our constituents. However, we are also working on the restart of dentistry more broadly. I understand the challenges, especially for those who want to see their own dentist and, frankly, for dentist practices. With NHS contracts, we've continued to keep the funds flowing, but of course, many dentists rely on their private income as well, and we support the mixed market in dentistry. What we need to do is get dentistry safely up and running when we can, but it has to be safe.
I'm pleased to say we've reconnected with the SNP spokesperson, Dr. Philippa Whitford, who's 90 seconds. Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome that eligibility for testing is being widened to all symptomatic cases as the first step towards a test, trace and isolate approach. But does the Secretary of State not agree that the system should have been in place before lockdown was eased? Without it, how can he know that the crowded public transport systems we saw last week aren't already leading to a rise in infections? The Secretary of State prides himself on having ramped up testing, but we know that many of thousands of those are just in the post. So can he clarify if these tests are counted again when they're actually carried out? The Royal College of GPs has highlighted the difficulty in getting test results back from the Deloitte regional test centres, as it's actually contact tracing and isolation that stops the spread of the virus. How will he speed up results and ensure that they're fed back to GPs and public health teams who are critical to detecting and controlling local outbreaks? The UK still has over 6 times the number of new cases per day than when the lockdown was brought in. Does he not think that's still too high to be sending people back to work and school?
Christie.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've been working very closely with the Scottish Government, the SNP Scottish Government, on testing, so I'm slightly surprised at some of the questions from the SNP spokeswoman. Of course the tests are not double counted. There has been a ramp up in testing capacity, and I'm very glad to see in Scotland testing capacity is now starting to rise to the latest figures of around 5,000. I work very closely with my SNP opposite number on making sure that everybody has the very best capacity. Now, of course, the contact tracing system was also stopped in Scotland. The reason for that is because the number of cases right across the UK became very high. We needed social distancing to bring that number down. Now that number is coming down right across the UK. It means that contact tracing is once again effective. That's the reason that we're bringing it in now, and I'm really pleased that we've hired in England 21,000 contact tracers to make sure that we can get this going, and therefore we are on track for the current proposed 1st of June changes. But of course, that date is dependent on making sure that everything is right and it's safe to make the changes then.
We go to St Albans. Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has just confirmed that there will be thousands of contact tracers who are not medically trained, but who will be handling highly sensitive patient information and issuing clinical advice given to them. So will he bring forward primary legislation to govern the collection and any potential misuse of data, whether that's via an app, by qualified health professionals or by the non-medical call handlers, so that members of the public can have confidence that all strands of his data collection plans are effective and safe?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I've looked at this proposal and it's clear that primary legislation is not needed because the Data Protection Act will do the job.
Andrew Rossender.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his unstinting dedication to protecting the health of our nation during this crisis? But would he firstly update the House on when the rollout for antibody testing will be revealed so we can start to get back to normality? And secondly, in last Friday's statement, he spoke about the reform of health and social care. So when will the government bring forward a lasting care funding solution to stop people in constituencies like Romford from being forced to sell their family homes to fund long-term care?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the whole country celebrated when there was the announcement last week that antibody testing that fits the bill and does the job had been approved by our Portendown labs. And we are in the closing stages of commercial negotiations to make sure that those tests are widely available, and I will let him know just as soon as I can when that rollout is, but I don't want to prejudice the commercial negotiations, which I'm sure he'll understand. On the second point, I strongly agree with my honourable friend that this crisis has demonstrated just how important social care reform is, just how important social care is, and how we must maintain the benefits and the improvements in delivery and working practice that happened because of the crisis and happened through the heat of the crisis. We must maintain and strengthen that close working relationship. The financial changes that we put through have proved very effective at bringing the two systems closer together, but there is much, much more to do.
We go over to Stockport with Navendu Mishra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent survey by Unison Northwest found that 8 out of 10 care workers would not receive full pay if they were ill, self-isolating, or shielding because of COVID-19. Receiving at most £95 per week statutory sick pay, with workers putting their lives on the line to look after us. Will the government provide increased funding and direction to ensure that all care workers receive full pay when they're absent due to COVID-19? In addition, given the current failings of our
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much. It's an incredibly important question, and one of the purposes of the £600 million extra that we're putting into the social care system that will go direct to the front line. It is not, local authorities are not allowed to use it for other purposes. That one of the purposes of that is to ensure that when social care staff need to be away from work for infection control purposes, then they're not penalised for doing so.
Go to Philip Dunn. Philip Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join my friend, the Honourable Member for Romford, and my right honourable friend for welcoming approval of an antibody test for use in the UK. I understand he can't elaborate on the timetable for its introduction, but could he tell us whether he's preparing for individuals to be able to input the results of an antibody test into the NHS COVID app to help demonstrate their immunity and improve our understanding of the prevalence of this wretched virus?
Secretary of State.
Well, yes, we have a, not through the COVID app, but we do have a process for people inputting whether they think they've had the virus. And as and when we manage to land an agreement on antibody testing, then I think that the proposition that he makes, the idea that he puts forward, is a very good one. After all, at the moment, the science is not clear as to the level of immunity and the risk that you pose to transmitting to others if you have antibodies, as many of us who have had the virus hope that we have. As that science becomes clearer, so we'll also be able to be clearer with our guidance to people who have a degree of immunity as to what they can do.
Stella Creasy. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, 1.8 million people in this country who are currently shielding were told that they would have to shield for an extra 2 weeks until the 30th of June. Can the Secretary of State confirm what protection there will be for them and their families so they do not face the threat of redundancy or sanction from not going to work or not going to school in order to follow that medical advice?
Secretary of State.
Yes, we've put in place extensive protections for people who are shielded, and those protections, of course, will continue to apply up until the 30th of June. The shielding is not something that we do lightly because we understand the very significant impact it has on those concerned and their families, but it is necessary in a pandemic like this.
Gareth Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Lincolnshire is fortunate to have good supplies of PPE, a relatively low infection rate and excellent capacity in our hospitals at this time. Will the Secretary of State join me in thanking our NHS staff across Lincolnshire who have been intensely dedicated to treating COVID-19 patients, but who are also increasingly aware of the needs of non-COVID patients as well?
Yes, I will. I think that the NHS restart is incredibly important in Lincolnshire and across the country. Lincolnshire, I know well, and it is really important that we restart other services that have had to be paused for understandable reasons. Lincolnshire not only is the home to so many dedicated health and social care staff. I pay tribute to all those who work in the NHS in Lincolnshire. My own grandmother was a nurse at the Pilgrim Hospital in Boston, and our great Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Professor Jonathan Van Tam, is himself a resident of Lincolnshire too. So Lincolnshire has many great things to offer in the sphere of health, and we've got to make sure that that's not just about COVID, it's about health services across the board.
Mary Kelly-Foy. Mary Kelly-Foy.
Mr. Speaker, the Office for National Statistics has reported that COVID-19 mortality rates in the most deprived areas of England are twice that of the least deprived. Once again, this virus has reminded us of the extreme health and social inequalities in our society. And whilst it can affect anyone from any background, those from the poorest communities have the highest risk and from severe illness and death. Here in the North East, we have some of the highest levels of deprivation in the country, as well as the highest rates of infection. Can the Secretary of State tell me what the government intend to do to reduce health inequalities, both during the COVID-19 lockdown and as part of our recovery from the impact of the virus?
Secretary of State.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and this is an incredibly important subject, both, as she says, during the crisis and thereafter. We've got a study underway that Public Health England is conducting into the impact of all sorts of different conditions on the likelihood that COVID-19 will hit you hard. It's true that there is a link to levels of deprivation in the same way that one of the strongest factors other than age is obesity, and that needs to be investigated. And we have seen a bigger impact on people from minority ethnic backgrounds. All these things need to be studied, and levelling up and closing that health inequality gap is an incredibly important part of the government's agenda for recovering from this terrible disease.
Jeremy Wright. Go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend has said, due to the hard work of the entire health and social care system, we can now look beyond this crisis. So as we do that, can I ask him to say more today and over the coming days about how we intend to balance the need to address a very substantial backlog of more routine and elective work that, as he says, has been understandably pushed aside by COVID-19 on the one hand, with on the other hand, the need to make sure that NHS staff who've been through an extremely stressful period have the time to recover?
That is one of the many balances that we will have to strike in the months and indeed the years to come as we recover from COVID-19. I would say there are three things that we're doing on that. The first is more staff. We brought in more staff, especially retired staff, and we want to keep them. They've been absolutely brilliant and a huge help to the NHS during the crisis. Second is more support to staff. I mentioned the mental health support, but all sorts of other wider support to staff right across health and social care. And the third thing is making sure that we rebuild the NHS, gaining from the improvements that have been made in the eye of this storm, because there have been improvements to ways of working. There have been huge stride forwards in the use of technology, and we've found areas where that has made a very big positive impact. So whilst, of course, there are parts of this crisis response we want to roll back, there are other parts that we want to pick up and take forward.
Olivia Blake.
Mr. Speaker, my constituent Rebecca's mother tragically died from coronavirus whilst working as a nurse in a Rotherham care home. The care home did not have access to the PPE she needed to keep safe. Rebecca wants to know how the PPE available to health and care professionals who have died in service will be recorded and considered. Will accepting the £60,000 death in servant payment prevent her family from making a negligence claim? And who signed off on the government strategy of sending untested patients to care homes?
Well, as I've said, we in care homes, we put in place infection control procedures as much as was possible at the start of this crisis, and there was not a great there wasn't an increase in the number of people going back to care homes, but my heart goes out to the family of the Honourable Lady's constituent who died working in social care, joining, I'm afraid to say, many others who gave service during this crisis and died as a result of it. I'm very happy to look specifically into her constituent's case. We do look into the death of any health or social care worker and make sure that we get to the bottom of all the lessons that can be learned. And I'm very happy personally to do that in the case of the constituent that the Honourable Lady has rightly raised.
Go to Lee Anderson. Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Care homes in Ashfield, such as Wren Hall, with an outstanding rating, and Sutton Manor, which is in the top 20 care homes in the East Midlands, face a difficult future. With empty beds due to COVID-19 comes a dramatic loss of income, which has a significant impact on their business. Could my right honourable friend please advise me on what safeguards are in place to ensure our care homes are supported to keep their doors open and continue to provide this exceptional level of care?
Well, I want to congratulate Wren Hall, because getting an outstanding rating is not easy, and Wren Hall have done that, and I want to congratulate every single member of staff, and I want to thank the honourable member for being such a champion for them and for bringing to my attention their outstanding rating when it was received. The funding, of course, is a critical part of this. We put in 600 million extra on Friday, and as I said, that will all go direct to care homes. That is not to go into local authority budgets for then onward consideration of passing to care homes. That is just to get to the care homes. That will help with infection control, but we've also got to make sure that funding is sustainable for the future.
Go to Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the British government announced in its daily briefing it hopes to have 30 million vaccines ready for use by September. Yet on the same day, the Prime Minister wrote in the Mail on Sunday stating that there may never be a vaccine. Considering the way Wales has been undermined by the British government over the distribution of PPE and testing, what confidence can the people of Wales have that we will have our fair share of vaccines if one is developed?
Secretary?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It isn't quite fair to say that Wales has not been served on PPE or on testing, where I've worked very closely with the Welsh Labour government And although the number of tests declared per day in Wales is low, is only just over 1,000, there is access to the UK-wide testing capabilities like the home testing and the drive-through centres. But on the substantive point that he makes about the vaccine, I'm absolutely delighted that we have been able to come to an agreement with AstraZeneca that will ensure that if the science behind the Oxford vaccine works, and if it does, it is likely to be one of the first available in the world, then we have agreement to make sure that 100 million doses are available for the UK, the first 30 million of which will be right at the start for the most vulnerable. That is a UK-wide policy. We'll deliver it right across these islands. I think that we should pay tribute to the work and the ingenuity of our scientists in Oxford and to the industrial might of AstraZeneca, who together, should they manage to pull off the science, will then be able to deliver this vaccine into our population as we need it. Vaccine science is an uncertain business, Mr. Speaker. That's why we cannot ever be 100% sure that there will be a safe and effective vaccine, but we're putting everything we possibly can into making sure that we can give them the best possible chance for every citizen of the whole United Kingdom.
Go across to Scott Benton. Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend confirm that thanks to the actions this government has taken and the brilliant response of the British people, we have prevented the NHS from being overwhelmed at any point during the current crisis, and this has meant that ordinary people have been able to receive a fantastic standard of care when they have needed it?
Yes, this is absolutely right. And the people of Blackpool, 2 months ago, were told that it would be difficult to get through this without the NHS being overwhelmed across the country. And we have, through the hard work of people who've done their bit and stayed at home and stayed alert, and through the NHS expansion, we have managed to ensure that every single person with coronavirus could get access to NHS treatment. And I think that the whole country should be proud of that.
Going over to Helen Hayes. Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a co-chair of the APPG for Adult Social Care, I've been speaking with social care providers across the country every single week since the start of this crisis. Not a single one would recognise the Secretary of State's description last week of a protective ring having been thrown around them. They had no access to PPE, no access to testing, and in some cases were told that ambulances would not take their residents to hospital. Now the sector is clear they need regular access to testing on a weekly basis for all staff and residents, with prompt access to results so that they can act to maintain infection control. Can the Secretary of State say when this essential measure will be in place?
Secretary of State.
Well, we absolutely did throw a protective ring around social care, not least with the £3.2 billion worth of funding we put in right at the start, topped up with £600 million worth of funding on Friday. Further to that, the Honourable Lady, I think, does know that testing has been carried out in care homes throughout. Of course, there's always more that we should and will do, but we've been working very hard and closely with the adult social care sector. Towards the start of this crisis, I was meeting the leaders of adult social care in Downing Street with the Prime Minister. We've been working very hard to tie together our response in what is a very diverse sector.
We go to Joy Morrissey. Joy Morrissey.
Will my right honourable friend join me in praising the work of local initiatives such as Makers for the NHS in Beaconsfield, who have volunteered their time and money to help contribute and deliver PPE to the NHS and care homes? Following the announcement of these new guidelines surrounding PPE production, can my right honourable friend ensure local groups like Makers for the NHS are not excluded in delivery of PPE? And will my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss how we can support local businesses who are already supporting the NHS and local COVID-19 responses?
Yes, I would be very happy to meet with my honourable friend, possibly via Zoom. or other video conferencing services are available, and to discuss what Makers for the NHS and other voluntary organisations and groups of volunteers have come together to deliver when it comes to PPE. I think it's absolutely fantastic. I'll pay tribute to the Daily Mail's PPE campaign. They've raised an enormous amount of money to bring in PPE from China, but those who are making it here in Britain, I salute and I thank.
We go over to Barry Sherman. Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, does the Secretary of State remember just about a month ago I upset him by telling him that his government's policy of this during this crisis was a shambles? I thought it was getting actually a grip on this crisis until last Sunday's disastrous performance by his Prime Minister. Now we have relaxed the advice to the country at a time when Yorkshire and the North East is doubling its R rate. What's he going to do about that? Can't he get a grip? Can't he stand up to the Prime Minister?
The R rate has not doubled in Yorkshire or indeed anywhere else in the country. And by contrast, as I said at the start of my speech, the good news is that things are progressing. The number of people in hospital is significantly down. The number of people in critical care is down by 2/3. And I think that we should be thanking and supporting our NHS staff and others and working together to get to the best possible outcome.
Sir David Ince.
Whilst acknowledging that no health secretary has faced the scale of challenges that my right honourable friend has, will he join with me in thanking all the staff at Southend Hospital and those who provide associated healthcare for their heroic efforts during this time of national crisis, and will he reassure them all that we do have plans to deliver this vaccine?
Yes, absolutely. To deliver the vaccine, we have plans such that, so if the science comes off, and we all hope as much as we possibly can that it will, then we will have the plans in place to ensure that the vaccine can safely be delivered to those who will benefit from it. And we have the agreement with AstraZeneca to the production of 100 million doses, 30 million right at the start of that programme. And I want to join my right honourable friend in thanking the staff of Southend Hospital, who've done so much in such difficult times to make sure that all of the community can get access to the support they need if they got coronavirus. And who I know now are working on the restoration of other services so that people with any health need can get the support they need.
Alan Brown, go over to Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to test, trace, isolate, the Scottish Government is expanding the resilience of the public health system. The UK Government is expanding outsourcing. Now, while the private sector is part of an overall solution, surely the Secretary should be doing more to limit the profits of the likes of Serco and Deloitte.
On the contrary, one of the things that we've learnt in this crisis, I think, as a nation, is that things are best delivered with people working together, public and private sector. And I think this crisis has ended for good the idea that the public sector alone should deliver certain services. Actually, teamwork is the best option.
We go to Darren Henry. Darren Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are rightly tackling the global pandemic COVID-19. However, there is a danger that the totally preventable diseases of measles, mumps and rubella will re-emerge if vaccinations are missed. Can my right honourable friend reassure me and parents in Broxtowe that it is safe and vital that scheduled vaccinations continue?
Yes, it's very important that the scheduled vaccination programme continues wherever possible, and we have protected it as much as possible. We've got to remember that with the vaccine, the hope of a vaccine for coronavirus, so too we've got to redouble efforts to vaccinate children for MMR and also this autumn for flu. Everybody will need to be getting a flu job if they possibly can, and we'll have more to say on that soon. It is really, really important that people vaccinate, and it's very important that anybody who hears messages from anti-vaxxers stands up to them and says that what they say is wrong and harmful.
Shana Raleigh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are reports that COVID-19 test results are coming in some 96 hours after testing. In this time, health workers and their families are at risk of catching the virus. Can the Health Secretary confirm if there are enough reagents, specifically in acute settings, to perform all COVID-19 tests within 24 hours?
Secretary of State.
Well, obviously, being able to perform all tests within 24 hours would be a great success. And we're trying to shorten the amount of time that it takes as much as possible. The average time is much, much shorter than 96 hours. I'll write to her with an exact figure in acute settings of the precise time. It is much, much shorter than that which she mentions. And all test results under 24 hours will be great. Sometimes it's just a matter of minutes or hours, depending on how busy the test centre is.
Sir Graham Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I return to the question asked by our honourable friend from Ashfield and ask my right honourable friend whether it's possible to give any specific support to care homes facing financial difficulties due to unusually high vacancy rates?
The answer that I tried to give at the end of maybe a too long an answer to my honourable friend for Ashfield is that yes, this is something I'm working on. It isn't something I'm able to announce today, but I do recognise the concerns and the challenges that the social care sector faces.
Catherine McKinnell.
Thank you. The number of daily new cases of coronavirus remains above 3,000 and the daily death rate higher than other countries, including Italy and Spain. We were slow to go into lockdown. We now seem to be in a rush to come out with restrictions relaxed before the test, track and trace system is fully in place, which may well be putting those numbers back up on the rise. Can he therefore understand why the public are anxious about the relaxation and plans to reopen schools, given the lack of systems in place now to minimise the risk of adding to the already devastating death toll?
Secretary of State.
Well, we've set out the 5 tests that need to be met before relaxation. We'll only do that cautiously and carefully, and I'd only sign up to it if it were safe. She raises schools, Mr. Speaker. It is very clear that the number of children who are badly affected by this disease is very, very, very small. It's a tiny proportion of the overall total, and this disease reserves its power and its risk for the elderly. And so the proposals that we've made for schools are safe and they are sensible. There clearly needs to be collaborative work to make sure they can happen, because there are also risks to children, especially some of the most vulnerable children, for not going to school.
Go to Suzanne Webb. Suzanne Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my right honourable friend for his incredible hard work and determination to get us through this crisis and helping to save many lives in my constituency. Will he join me in thanking some of the amazing groups and organisations in my constituency of Stourbridge, like staff at Russell's Hall Hospital, Mary Stevens Hospice, our care homes, community pharmacists and volunteers, and all those unsung heroes who continue to work day in and day out, saving lives and supporting the most vulnerable?
State.
Yes, I would be... I'd be very happy, I'd be honoured to join my honourable friend in thanking the staff at Russell's Hall Hospital and at Mary Stevens Hospice and at the care homes and the community pharmacists and indeed the volunteers of Stourbridge who have come together. And there have been many terrible things about this disease, but there have been also some heartwarming things, and the dedication of staff and volunteers alike to come to the aid of others has been one of the things that I think the whole nation has been proud to see.
Andrew Gwynn. Going to Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. But the Secretary of State will know the concerns across Northern England about the government's approach to easing lockdown, and specifically those raised by the Greater Manchester Mayor and the Combined Authority at the risk of a second wave of coronavirus owing to differential R values across our city region. So what measures is he putting in place to ensure, as lockdowns lifted across England, those areas behind London in the curve do not see all the hard work undone?
State.
Well, of course, we take the decision on looking at the information for the whole country. And if you look at where the whole country is, we have to take into account the R rate and the level of new cases and all other data from right across the land to decide what is the appropriate step to recommend and to take. And we do this cautiously, we do it carefully, and we make sure that everybody is taken into consideration and the safety of the whole population is right at the front of our minds.
Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wolverhampton has united throughout this coronavirus crisis, and we have been testing for the virus at a rapid pace. Reagenting chemicals and swabs we have been using has reduced in the last week, and this impacts the testing in care homes. Could my right honourable friend address this as a matter of urgency so we can continue testing at the pace we need to?
Secretary of State.
Yes, I this weekend was looking at the question of making sure that there's enough testing capacity specifically in Wolverhampton, and we're acting to make sure that everybody right across Wolverhampton, like the whole country, can benefit from the hugely expanding testing capability that there is.
Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, in South Wales and industrial towns, former miners with severe breathing issues are extremely vulnerable to COVID-19. These miners deserve recompense for years of dangerous work, but this is only possible after death if industrial disease is also noted on their death certificates. So will the Secretary of State please ask his officials to work with the Mine Workers Union to ensure that industrial diseases, as well as COVID-19, are considered as causes of death so that grieving families can access the support that they need?
Secretary of State.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'm from mining stock myself, from Nottinghamshire rather than from South Wales, and so I entirely understand the impact that that mining has on breathing and on respiratory disease, and of course I understand the impact of respiratory disease in turn on the likelihood of having a bad response to coronavirus. So I'd be very happy to take up the point that he makes, to contact those, I think, in the business department who are responsible for specifically for redress for miners, and to write to him.
We go to Mark Menzies. Mark Menzies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I currently have a care home in Fylde where 16 residents died in April. This represents around half of those in the home. 6 of the remaining residents are displaying symptoms, but they're being told that they will have to wait until mid-June for further tests, following errors made by Randox a few weeks ago. Can the Secretary of State please investigate this matter and work with me to resolve this really important issue?
Secretary of State.
Yes, of course I can. I will take that up immediately, and we'll try to get a resolution. Thankfully, we've got the testing capacity to be able to resolve problems like that.
We go to Mohammed Yazin. Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my constituents has written to me as a worried grandmother and mother of a teacher. When scientists are divided over coronavirus risk to children and how they might spread the virus, is it this grandmother right to ask me why is Parliament virtually empty due to social distancing measures, but her grandchild, who is least able to socially distance, is expected to return to school?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've taken a cautious and a balanced and a safety-first approach to restarting schools. That's why we've taken the approach that we have of just 3 years being proposed in the first instance, to ensure that there can be more social distancing at schools. Of course, as a father of 3 small children, I get that that is more challenging than amongst adults, but it is necessary, and the approach that we've proposed is safe, is signed off by medical advisors as safe, and of course, because there's hardly any impact on children of this disease, a very, very small number of children are badly affected. That means that parents can be confident that if they send their child to school, then that's a safe environment for them.
Andy Carter. Andy Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During Mental Health Awareness Week, would the Secretary of State agree with me that local volunteer-led mental health groups meeting regularly on Zoom here in Warrington South, such as Offload Rugby League and Man Talk, are providing an absolutely vital service for men during these unprecedented times, and they really should continue to receive the government's full backing?
Secretary of State.
Absolutely. I pay tribute to Men Talk and to Offload Rugby League and to all those who are working to support the mental health of others during this difficult crisis.
Go to Hilary Benn. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Many teachers and school staff are anxious about a return to the classroom, especially those who have medical conditions or who are living with someone who is shielding. I understand that it will not be a requirement, but can the Secretary of State just clarify whether, if for reassurance, staff at times want to wear face coverings and or visors, they are perfectly free to do so?
They are not advised to do so. What staff do within a school is a matter for their head.
We now come to Jameson.
Mr. Speaker, could I please ask the Secretary of State whether the NHS is taking full advantage of the military logistics expertise currently available, and is there greater value to be had?
Secretary of State. And some. I mean, the military have been unbelievably helpful in this crisis, right across the extraordinary things that my teams and the whole NHS have had to do in terms of logistics, in terms of delivery on the ground, literally boots on the ground. The military, just like the private sector that we were discussing earlier, have made the testing capability possible. They've supported care homes. They've done an amazing thing. They have really risen to the challenge.
We go to Joanna Cherry. Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Most countries have imposed some form of public health measures upon international travellers in order to limit imported cases of the virus. The United Kingdom has been out of step on this since the middle of March. And today we heard that details of a quarantine scheme won't be published until next month. As Health Secretary, will he publish the detailed scientific advice upon which the United Kingdom's approach has been based in this matter since the middle of March?
Secretary of State. Mr. Speaker, we're working on a Four Nations approach and trying to make sure that the approach that we have to international travel is aligned across all four nations, including with the SNP government in Edinburgh. And we've, of course, based those decisions on scientific advice, and we'll make sure that as and when that advice is updated, as we move through this pandemic, so the decisions continue to be based on that advice.
Miriam Cates.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fortunately, coronavirus presents an extremely low risk to children, and I'm delighted that schools are able to plan to reopen from the 1st of June. We will need to monitor closely the effects of this on numbers of COVID-19 infections. So can my right honourable friend reassure parents and teachers that every effort is being made to ensure test, track and trace will be available in time for schools reopening?
Secretary of State. Well, that's right. My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. The numbers of children who've died is sadly more than none, but very, very low compared to adults. And it is absolutely right that test and trace, getting that up and running, is important. So I'm delighted that today we've recruited 21,000 contact tracers ahead of the goal I set that by today we'd recruit 18,000 and 7,500 of those medical professionals to make sure that we can deliver safely on the opening of schools, which is so important to so many.
Sir Olney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the subject of those 21,000 contact tracers, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Secretary of State what is being done to support and supervise and train these contact tracers in what will be an incredibly sensitive job, both in dealing with the individuals affected, but also in dealing with their data and in other privileged information.
Secretary of State.
Well, yes, she's absolutely right, and that training is underway.
Please do, Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've got a big BAME community in my constituency of Kensington. Can you assure me that Public Health England will look into the effect of ethnicity on outcomes?
Secretary of State.
Yes, and James Fenton, who's the London lead for public health within Public Health England, is undertaking exactly the review that she asked for, and with a which we propose to publish in the coming weeks.
Clive Efford.
The government has promised to carry out routine testing in care homes, yet my local authority tells me that there's a shortage of the home test kits needed to do this, and that they fear that they'll be diverted to fulfil another of the government's pledges on tracking and tracing as more become available. Yet again, the government has made a claim that is not borne out by the situation in our care homes. So by what dates will we have enough home care test kits to carry out routine testing in care homes?
Secretary of State.
I'm very happy to ensure that my team get in contact with this local authority, not least to explain that home testing is only one of the avenues available, and in fact the bigger, much more testing in care homes is done through the mobile testing units, where the mobile unit goes to the care home, or by the satellite units when a whole batch are taken to the care home, rather than the home testing channel, which is designed for sending an individual test or a small number of tests to an individual house.
Rob Butler, going over to Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An unheralded aspect of the comfort that's been brought to patients in the coronavirus crisis has come from hospital radio stations like the one at Stoke Mandeville. Will my right honourable friend join me in thanking the volunteers who've provided the only company to COVID patients when they weren't allowed to have visitors, and do all he can to support hospital radio stations in the months and years ahead?
Secretary of State. My honourable friend should be very proud to represent Stoke Mandeville Hospital and Stoke Mandeville Hospital Radio, because he's right that hospital radio is always important, but at times like this when visitors haven't been able to go into hospitals, it's even more important, and I'm very, very pleased that he raised it.
Ben Lake.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State has mentioned that both the R rate and the level of new cases are important factors in determining the government's decision-making. But could he clarify whether the way in which these factors differ across the UK will also be considered in future planning, including in relation to financial assistance programmes?
Secretary of State.
Yes.
We go to audio only. Dan Jarvis. Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Inequality is not new, but this is injustice. The COVID-19 mortality rate, the poorest 10%, is around double that of the most affluent. Does the Secretary of State agree that we must tackle this disparity, and will he commit to building a healthier country as we emerge from this crisis?
I think he's got it. Secretary of State.
Yes, I will.
We go to Dr. James Davies. Dr. James Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's widely believed that the impact of COVID-19 in the UK has been greater due to high levels of obesity. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that we must do more to tackle the causes of obesity in our society?
Secretary of State.
Yes, it is. In fact, it is true that the early evidence shows that obesity is a major factor in the impact on an individual of COVID-19. And in fact, in one early study by Dr. Ben Goldacre, it implied that serious obesity is one of the greatest factors after age. And so we must make sure that we tackle obesity across the nation. I look forward very much to working with the Prime Minister to bring forward plans to tackle obesity. And I'd also like, if I may, cheekily, Mr. Speaker, to also thank all community first responders for the work that they're doing, because I know that my honourable friend, the member for Brigg and Gould, wanted to ask about that.
I'm now suspending the House for 15 minutes till 4:49. Order, order.